So the wind howled through the broken windows of the orphanage, carrying with it the sharp sting of winter. Inside, in a corner too dark to be noticed, Sarah sat huddled in a ragged blanket. At just 9 years old, she had learned more about cruelty than most adults. The orphanage was her world, a world that reeked of neglect, hunger, and the heavy weight of silence. Sarah had come here 3 years ago, after the accident that had claimed her parents' lives. Since then, the orphanage had become her prison, and Mrs. Craven, the headmistress, her warden. No one visited, no one cared. Each day was a repetition of the last harsh chores, cold meals, and nights filled with the cries of children too scared or too lonely to sleep. But Sarah had learned not to cry. Crying only attracted attention, and attention in this place brought trouble. The other children called her the quiet one, her silence both a shield and a curse. She longed for escape, but where would she go? The world beyond the orphanage's walls was as frightening as the one within. And yet, somewhere deep inside her, a tiny spark of hope flickered. One day she promised herself she would be free. Before the orphanage, Sarah's life had been filled with warmth and love. Her parents, both kind and gentle, had taught her that the world was a place of wonder. Her father, an artist, often took her to the park, where they would sit for hours watching birds, people, and the way the light changed throughout the day. Her mother, a schoolteacher, filled their home with stories, books, and music. They were not wealthy, but Sarah had never felt deprived. It all changed in an instant. The car accident happened on a rainy afternoon, the day where everything feels heavy with sadness. Sarah had survived, but her parents had not. In the blink of an eye, her world shattered. With no relatives willing to take her in, she was sent to the orphanage. The memories of her life before had become a double-edged sword. They were her solace in the darkest moments, but they also reminded her of everything she had lost. Some nights she would close her eyes and pretend she could hear her mother's voice, soft and sweet, reading her favorite bedtime story. But when she opened her eyes, she was back in the cold, dark orphanage, and the dream would slip away. The orphanage, known as Grey Hollow, was a place where hope seemed to go to die. Situated on the outskirts of the city, its tall, gray walls loomed like a fortress, shutting out the world beyond. Inside, everything felt broken: the furniture, the windows, even the children. There were too many of them, all packed into cramped, drafty rooms. The older kids bullied the younger ones, and the staff barely noticed. They were too overwhelmed, or, in some cases, too indifferent to care. Meals were meager and tasteless: thin soup, stale bread, and occasionally a few slices of cheese. The children were always hungry. Some of them fought over scraps, while others, like Sarah, learned to endure the pangs of hunger in silence. There were no toys, no books, no laughter. The orphanage was run like a machine, with strict schedules and little warmth. Chores were assigned every day, and failure to complete them resulted in harsh punishments. The worst part wasn't the physical discomfort, it was the feeling of being forgotten. No one cared about the children at Grey Hollow. They were ghosts, invisible to the world, and each day they sank deeper into the shadows of neglect. Mrs. Craven was the embodiment of everything wrong with Grey Hollow. A tall, thin woman with sharp features and an even sharper tongue, she ruled the orphanage with an iron fist. Her cold, calculating eyes seemed to pierce through the children's souls, seeking out their weaknesses, and she took great pleasure in exploiting them. To the outside world, she presented herself as a devoted caretaker, sacrificing her time for the unfortunate. But behind closed doors, she was a tyrant. She seemed to delight in tormenting the children, particularly those who were too quiet or too weak to fight back. Sarah, with her quiet demeanor, quickly became one of Mrs. Craven's favorite targets. The punishments were cruel and unusual extra chores that lasted late into the night, denial of food, and sometimes isolation in the cold, damp cellar. But it wasn't just physical. Miss Craven's cruelty was psychological. She whispered to the children that no one wanted them, that they were unwanted burdens, and that they would never escape Grey Hollow. Sarah learned to avoid her, to stay out of her line of sight, but sometimes it was impossible. Mrs. Craven seemed to have a special sense for when Sarah was near, and she always found a reason to punish her. The older children had warned Sarah about her when she first arrived, but nothing could prepare her for the depth of the woman's malice. As the days blurred into weeks and the weeks into months, Sarah's quiet determination grew. She began to watch and listen more closely, taking note of the times when Mrs. Craven left the orphanage to attend to errands, the shifts of the night staff, and the night routines of the other children. Escape, once a distant dream, became a plan. It wasn't just for her. Some of the younger children were too weak to survive much longer in Grey Hollow. Little Ellie, who shared Sarah's room, had developed a persistent cough, and there was no sign of help from the outside. Mrs. Craven ignored Ellie's illness, as she did with all signs of weakness, but Sarah couldn't. She knew if she stayed, Ellie, and possibly others, wouldn't make it. With the help of a few trusted friends, Sarah began gathering supplies: scraps of bread, bits of clothing to protect them from the cold, and the few small coins they could find or steal. They didn't have much, but they had each other, and that, Sarah believed, was enough. One stormy night when the orphanage was quiet and Mrs. Craven was fast asleep, Sarah made her move. With Ellie by her side, she slipped through the orphanage's back door, which had been left unguarded. The cold rain hit them like needles, but they didn't stop. Freedom was just a few steps away, and for the first time in years, Sarah dared to hope. The city was vast and overwhelming, especially to two small children who had only ever known the suffocating walls of Grey Hollow. The streets were wet and dark, illuminated only by the occasional flicker of a street lamp. Sarah held tightly to Ellie's hand as they weaved through alleys and side streets, trying to stay out of sight. Every sound a distant shout, the clatter of a garbage can sent their hearts racing. At first, they didn't know where to go. The idea of escape had always been Sarah's driving force, but now that they were outside, the reality of their situation hit her hard. They had no home, no family, and no one to help them. But Sarah was determined. She had heard stories from the older children about places in the city where people cared for orphans, places where they could be safe. The journey was far from easy. They spent their first night in a cold, abandoned building, huddled together for warmth. Hunger gnawed at their bellies, and Sarah worried for Ellie, whose cough had worsened. But they pressed on, guided by the faint glimmers of hope and the kindness of strangers. Along the way, they met a kind old woman who gave them bread and milk, and a street vendor who let them rest in the warmth of his stall for a few hours. These small acts of kindness kept Sarah going, reminding her that not everyone in the world was like Mrs. Craven. There was goodness out here, and she was determined to find it. After days of wandering the streets, Sarah and Ellie found themselves outside a modest building tucked away in a quiet corner of the city. It didn't look like much from the outside, but Sarah had heard whispers about this place, a shelter run by people who cared for children like them, who had nowhere else to go. With Ellie too weak to walk much farther, Sarah decided to take a chance. She knocked on the door, her heart pounding in her chest. For a moment, she feared no one would answer, but then the door creaked open, and a woman with kind eyes looked down at them. The shelter was nothing like Grey Hollow. It was warm and clean, with soft beds and enough food for everyone. The people here treated Sarah and Ellie with kindness, asking no questions about their past and expecting nothing in return. For the first time in years, Sarah felt safe. The weight of fear and desperation that had clung to her since her parents' death began to lift. The people at the shelter helped Ellie recover from her illness and offered Sarah something she had almost forgotten existed: hope. Here she learned that there were others like her, children who had escaped dark places and found light in the kindness of strangers. But for the first time, Sarah allowed herself to believe that she could have a future, one that didn't involve fear or hunger or Miss Craven's cruelty. As Sarah settled into her new life at the shelter, the nightmares of Grey Hollow began to fade, but they never disappeared completely. She often woke in the middle of the night, drenched in sweat, her heart racing as memories of Mrs. Craven's voice echoed in her mind. It was a voice she couldn't shake, one that had ingrained itself in her deepest fears. Sarah knew she couldn't fully move on without confronting the past. She began talking to the shelter's counselor, a gentlewoman named Clara, who encouraged her to share her story. At first, it was difficult. Sarah had kept her pain locked away for so long that speaking about it felt like reopening old wounds. But slowly, she began to talk about the orphanage, Mrs. Craven, and the children she had left behind. Clara helped Sarah understand that her past, while painful, didn't have to define her. She also reminded Sarah that it was okay to grieve for what she had lost, to mourn her parents and the life she could have had. It was part of healing. One day, with Clara by her side, Sarah returned to Grey Hollow. It was a difficult decision, but Sarah knew it was necessary. She needed to see that place one last time, to face Mrs. Craven and the ghosts of her past. As she stood outside the orphanage's gates, she realized something powerful. She was no longer the helpless child who had suffered in silence. She had survived, and that made her stronger than she ever knew. Months passed, and Sarah's life began to take on a new shape. The shelter had become a home not just for her, but for Ellie as well. The two had become inseparable, like sisters bound by a shared past. With Ellie now healthy and laughing once more, Sarah felt a sense of peace she hadn't known in years. The people at the shelter helped her enroll in school, where she discovered a love for learning, just like her mother. She began to dream of becoming a teacher one day, of helping children who had suffered as she had. But the kindness she had been shown inspired her to give back, to become the sort of person who could offer hope to others. And while the memories of Grey Hollow and Mrs. Craven would always be a part of her, they no longer controlled her. She had faced her fears, confronted her past, and emerged stronger. The orphanage might have been her beginning, but it wasn't her end. As she stood in the shelter's garden one morning, the sun warming her face, Sarah smiled. She was free. Free to dream, free to live, and free to love. And with that freedom came the realization that her future was hers to shape a future filled with hope, possibility, and the echoes of kindness.
There are a lot of lessons to be learned from this story. I would love to hear your opinion in comment section. Thank you for watching, and please don't forget to like, share, and press the red button to subscribe to my channel. Bye.